Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, debt slave serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I want to do a video on Putin, the Peacemaker. And it's ironic in the world that we live in today that Putin, the leader of Russia for many years now, is turning out to be the most sane, logical, compassionate leader almost in the entire globe. And I don't say that lightly, but whatever else you may think of Putin and his sinister background, his rise to power, and his continuing grip on power in Russia, the facts speak for themselves. And I know this is totally against the narrative of the West, this astonishing narrative and demonization of Russia. And as I've mentioned before, they call it a cruel and unprovoked attack on Ukraine by Russia. But as I point out in other videos, Putin was actually very patient. The West and the United States installed a puppet government in Ukraine after a CIA instigated coup, and then Ukraine continued to bomb and attack the breakaway Russian regions who had a referendum. And something like over 90% of the people in all those breakaway regions, all Russian speakers, voted to break away from Ukraine and rejoin the Russian Federation. And Ukraine not only instigated this war on them for 8 years, but also introduced all kinds of legislation to oppress and repress the Russian peoples in those regions, including attacking the Orthodox Church and outlawing them from even using the Russian language. So anyway, so it was hardly a cruel and unprovoked war. Putin waited 8 years and finally lost his patience and moved into Ukraine. And on top of that, Putin chose to basically not uh, attack Ukraine and confiscate and annex the country into some fabled reconstruction of the Soviet Union and a Russian empire. Um, that wasn't his aim, and he's made that very clear. It was to uh, stop Ukraine's offensive capabilities against Russians living within inside Russia. And I welcome all the attacks I probably get about being a Putin ass kisser and a Russian asset and a useful idiot. Um, I am none of those things, but I just see things clearly and logically and have an understanding of history and geopolitics. And I just see the facts. I am indeed a Russian asset because about 10 years ago, when I was doing this channel previously, I was interviewed on Russia Today, and it was a great honor because I thought Russia Today was one of the best news outlets in the world. And of course, as they were airing out the dirty laundry and speaking the truth, of course, American politicians, Congress, and the president had to ban Russia Today because they didn't want competition distributing countering their constant misinformation. So anyway, I think fondly of Russia Today, and the fact that they recognized me is very flattering and a great honor. But anyway, let's get to the bulk of this story, and that's the recent Putin peace proposal. A very generous one, I would say, considering the brutality of this war and the brutality coming from Ukraine for the most part. Um, Putin proposed that he would end the war today if Ukraine would withdraw from the Russian breakaway regions um, and then not join NATO. And that's perfectly reasonable. That's all he's wanted all along. And the fact is that the West and Europe and the US have been pushing this war. They want regime change. They want the destruction of Russia as we know it. They want Putin removed from power. And this is their mechanism to do so in this proxy war in Ukraine. And of course, the tragedy of it is that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of poor Ukrainians of all ages with all kinds of disabilities are being slaughtered for nothing because this is a war Ukraine will never ever win. And that's just the fact of it. You know, the fact that U.S. media and U.S. politicians and European politicians push this incredible, astonishing mythology that Ukraine just needs more weapons and more backing, and somehow they are going to prevail over Russia. It's so ridiculous. It's beyond belief. As I often say, it's a world gone mad, and it truly is. And so there was also a speech recently by Secretary of Defense Austin, who once again says that Russia is illegally occupying parts of Ukraine, which is a mischaracterization. Russia is merely protecting Russian-speaking zones in Ukraine who had referendums, want to break away from Ukraine and join the Russian Federation. And the fact that the U.S. and Europe calls those sham elections, the referendum where well over 90% of the people wanted to rejoin Russia, they call them sham elections. And that's, of course, part of a pattern too. The United States and Europe say that they want to spread democracy and freedom around the world. And then every time someone has an election and are displaying a method of democracy, the U.S. calls them sham elections because they don't like the results. That happened in Gaza and in Palestine as well. You know, they talk about democracy, and then the people in Palestine voted to have Hamas be their government. And why wouldn't they? That's too long a story to go in here now. But of course, there's a democratic election. The U.S. doesn't like the results, and they don't recognize them. So much for democracy. And then the other thing was Secretary of Defense Austin talking about the fact that Putin is not in a position to dictate terms. I would say very soundly that Putin is exactly in the position to dictate terms. Only he seems to have the sanity and be in a position to end this war in Ukraine right now. And I fully agree. If the terms were met, Russia is in a position to end the war right now. And in fact, another example of this is a story that came out recently in the New York Times, where Putin offered another peace deal 2 years ago. And he was actually quite generous at that time. He offered a settlement mere weeks into the war, and he offered to actually let Ukraine keep Crimea. That's very generous because, once again, as I've mentioned in other videos, Crimea was part of Russia, and only 50 or so years ago, Russia ceded Crimea to Ukraine, and they didn't, as characterized in the Western narrative, Putin didn't just go in and invade Crimea and annex it. He basically reneged on an agreement that Ukraine reneged on and took Crimea back. And just like the breakaway regions in Ukraine, they had a referendum in Crimea, and once again, 90% of the population wanted to rejoin Russia, a predominantly Russian-speaking zone and historically part of Russia. And so for Putin to offer Crimea up in that deal was insanely generous of him. And then he also, once again, his terms then and now was Ukraine was not to be part of NATO, that they would be neutral. And that's been a linchpin of Putin's attitude all along, and rightfully so. He doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO and have a hostile force right on his border. And that's a very reasonable request. The promises were made by the West after the Warsaw Pact folded and the collapse of the Soviet Union. All the Eastern European countries and the U.S. promised that they would not be all absorbed into NATO and be right on Russia's border, including massive amounts of troops and possible nuclear weapons right on Russia's border. Who wouldn't feel threatened by that? Any other nation in the world would feel that way. And so um, one by one, of course, every single one of those countries, and now the Nordic region and the Baltics, have all joined NATO. And let remind you that why wouldn't Russia be threatened by all this to have hostile forces basically encircling Russia, which is the position we're in now, um, and all the hostile rhetoric. And that's another thing about the narrative that's out there. We have all these politicians and leaders in the United States and all over Europe talking very inflammatory rhetoric, very warlike, very escalating, directed at Russia, and Putin has responded, as any strong leader would, to this rhetoric, and basically going toe to toe with all these leaders that are openly threatening Russia, not only with troop mobilizations, massive rearming, conscription, the draft, and the threat of using nuclear weapons. And so the fact that Putin is maintaining a level of sanity and calm in this, and just being a leader for his country, is what's to be expected. And the other demands that Putin made in 2022 were also reasonable. He just wanted Ukraine to respect the rights of the Russian regions. The Russian regions could potentially remain in Ukraine, but just respect the rights of the Russian regions there, repeal the language restrictions, and then, of course, not to have any pro-Nazi statues. And once again, pretty minimal, very reasonable requests. And the basis of my video, of course, is to say that Putin is the peacemaker, because the U.S. and Europe, every step of the way, including back in 2022, there was some possibility of negotiations, a possibility of stopping this horrific war, this horrific slaughter, and the U.S. Basically crushed it. Europe and U.S. crushed it. They've crushed every attempt since then to stop the war, and they will continue crushing and stopping any attempts to settle this war. And as I've mentioned in another video, there's a number of reasons for that. One, it's a great proxy war for a number of reasons. They can test out all the latest military equipment the U.S. and Europe has to see how it matches up with Russian capabilities. They can get in a position to, when the war is over, to make a lot of money reconstructing Ukraine and confiscating all their assets and resources. And then they can also use this to try and destabilize Russia and eventually have regime change and the destruction of Russia as we know it. And then most importantly, this is a total cash cow for the arms manufacturers and the military-industrial complex. They don't want this war to end. They're making money hand over fist. Their record number of global arms sales for everybody in the globe that sells weapons because of Ukraine. They don't care how many peasants are slaughtered in the field and how much Ukrainian blood the ground is soaked with. And they certainly don't give a shit about Russian casualties. The more the better. But the bottom line is it's a moneymaker. The longer the war goes on, the more money they make. And as I pointed out in a previous video as well, you know, all this aid that we're giving to Ukraine, you know, these hundreds of billions of dollars we're giving Ukraine that would be better well spent in the U.S. because people are hurting here. All that money is given to them, but a lot of it is going to sustain the country. It's paying their salaries. It's helping reconstruct their electrical grid that's destroyed every few weeks. It's going to bolster every aspect of living in Ukraine. Then on top of that, a lot of that money is being squirreled away by corrupt oligarchs and corrupt people in the government, including Zelensky. They're squirreling away millions and billions of dollars into their personal bank accounts and going on shopping sprees around the globe, buying lavish properties. And so it's just disgusting on every level. And then the last thing I want to finish up about is, of course, this recent development where 4 Russian ships and a nuclear submarine steamed into Cuba, Havana Harbor, and are there now. And of course, it's eerily reminiscent of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis when Soviet Union constructed missile sites in Cuba right off the coast of the United States. And we were on the brink of nuclear war over that incident. And Soviet Union backed down at that time, and the world was saved for a moment. And that's the narrative on the surface. But now we have this ironic deja vu with Russian ships in Cuba now, not very far off the coast of the United States. And the thing that's immediately apparent to me is the staggering hypocrisy of the United States and the West in a situation like this, because we have U.S. fleets that are operating all around Russia today, and the West has massive amounts of troops and weapons on countries bordering Russia and encircling Russia on all sides, and that's okay. But to have a few Russian ships be in the Western Hemisphere and off to the coast of USA somehow is completely outrageous, and the U.S., could potentially get into a war and possibly a nuclear war over an incident like this. The hypocrisy is staggering. But as I often say, hypocrisy is the coin of the realm in a world gone mad, the world we live in now. So there we have it. Once again, I want to say that ironically, Putin is the peacemaker in the world, and he's offering an easy way out with minimal demands, and the war could end today, but it won't, because the U.S. and Europe, they want war, and the longer this war goes on, the more they like it and the more money they make, and the worse the war gets, the more they like it and the more money they make. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.